Call on Government Orders of the Day, numbers 2 and 3.
New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Amendment Bill, third reading, and Taxation, New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Bill, third reading.
Speaker. The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I move that the New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Amendment Bill and the Taxation, New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Bill be now read a third time. Mr Speaker, this bill's been taken a while actually to get to the point where we're completing the process, but it's pretty important. It's pretty important probably for as much for what it doesn't do as what it does do. This relates to the New Zealand Superannuation Fund and what it's allowed to do under the 2001 Act. I think, as I said in the second reading of this bill, the New Zealand Superannuation Fund was set up in a way that was fundamentally sound, and Dr. Michael Cullen deserves credit for that. It was set up in order to retain and maintain its political independence because of the basic insight that a multi-billion-dollar fund, now $27 billion, could look attractive to politicians who had their own objectives in mind rather than the very long-term objectives of this fund, which are to help offset the cost of national super through the 20s, 30s, 40s and into the 2050s. And so it was set up with that degree of independence. There was another, and that's something that this House, I think, must pay attention to, and I'll come back to why that's relevant in just a minute. One of the restrictions on the fund is that it can't take a controlling interest in any entity. This is simply to prevent what is already a large fund running a whole lot of businesses. In my own view, that would be not good for the economy because a government-controlled fund can't really go out of business. It wouldn't have the right incentives to improve the performance of businesses that it owned by majority. There may not be much test of the management of those businesses, so quite reasonably the House has had a position now for 15 years that it shouldn't own businesses in its own right, but it can own part of any business in New Zealand pretty much, and overseas. The issue here is that as it diversifies its portfolio around the globe, and by far the bulk of its investment is offshore, that is, we take money that was taxpayers' money, goes through government into the fund, and they then invest it offshore, and in recent years there hasn't been any of that, but they've been making healthy returns on their investments and reinvesting those returns. And in the modern world of funds management, investment entities are set up, and in this legislation these are referred to as fund investment vehicles. And so the bill has a very specific purpose. That is to say that while the fund is not allowed to own any particular business in majority, it can have a controlling interest over an entity set up just for the purposes of managing investments. Just for the purposes of managing investments. The intent of this is to reduce some of the costs that the fund now incurs. Where we can reduce their costs, we increase their returns, and over a 30, 40, 50-year life of the fund, that could have a big impact on the fund's performance, a significant impact. Just in the same way as when you look at a KiwiSaver fund and look at fees of 1.5% when the returns are so up, 5 or 6% or less, a small reduction in those fees has a significant influence on the returns to the fund. So the bill provides the Guardians with some added flexibility around how they implement their investment strategy. There is also the companion bill, the Taxation bill, that provides that for the taxation of fund investment vehicles in the same way as current taxation of the fund as a whole. The Greens seem to interpret this as enabling the New Zealand Super Fund, wholly owned by the New Zealand Government, being able to use these new fund investment vehicles as some way of indulging in behaviour around tax havens. We want to be pretty clear that this bill doesn't change any of the investment universe available to Guardians or its current approach to tax. They'll have to comply with tax law wherever they invest in the future, the same way as they do now. And I'm satisfied that the arrangements are the right ones. On the way through, there was really only one point of discussion on the way through the process, and that is whether the Minister of Finance should approve the fund investment vehicles. And as someone who's had a little bit of experience in that job, it's certainly my strong view that the Minister of Finance shouldn't be involved in any way in the investment decisions of the fund, even if it looks like it was going to be a fairly technical intervention. In my view, it's much better that all those investment decisions are completely at arm's length from the politicians, and as it happens on the way through the Parliament, the House has come to the view that that's probably the best way to manage it. There's always an argument at the margin for the politician to somehow get involved in a way that might enable officials to have a bit more oversight of this fund, or a small adjustment at the margin, but I think, in my view, any move in that direction will simply compound itself on another move in that direction, and before long you could have some real problems of political interference in the operation of the fund. There are legitimate issues for government which we are doing a bit of work on, and that is that the fund takes risk with investments. We know that because they've been making 20% plus returns in some years. You only do that by taking risks. But the government has to satisfy itself it understands what risks are being taken and that they're broadly acceptable on the Crown balance sheet. And that's a matter of some ongoing consideration by Treasury. So can I thank both the House and the Finance and Expenditure Committee for dealing with a pretty pragmatic bill designed to slightly reinforce what we hope will be the long-term success of the New Zealand Superannuation Fund.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Speaker.